Today you're going to hear some pretty frightening stories from women who say that they have become prisoners of men who won't let them go and are stalking their every move. They say they're scared to death, and really no woman is safe. So today not only are we going to hear their chilling tales of being stalked, we're also going to show you how you can protect yourself or your child from a stalker who would be out to get you. As a mother myself, I can't imagine anything more frightening than knowing that your child is in harm's way. Well, this is Joann. Her daughter, Nikki, was killed 7 years ago by a boyfriend who wouldn't let her go. That young man is now out of jail. We're going to find out about that. And Joann says he is now still stalking and terrorizing her family. But there's more. Joann is afraid that her nightmare is repeating itself because Joann's other daughter, Christy, is now being stalked by her ex-boyfriend. And Joann says that this is more than she can take, understandably. Joann, that's incredible. You only had 2 daughters, right?
Right.
2 daughters from the same family. One has been murdered, and now your other daughter is being stalked. Let's go back and talk about what happened to your oldest daughter, to Nikki, because I think that's an important point. You said you kept your head in the sand, and you didn't realize the danger your daughter was in until it was too late. But I'm not so sure that any of us might not have done the same thing. Tell us what happened.
Well, Nikki had been in a real good relationship with a previous boyfriend, and I asked her to come home to get an education so they could really make it work. I wanted him to go home and get an education, really work. Well, they ended up splitting up.
Did she blame you?
Yeah, she was upset. She wanted me to talk to him, and I didn't do it, and I should have, and I didn't. And it's a long story, but she ended up with the person that took her life. He was she was quite petite, 94 pounds, 5'1.5", and a big guy. She felt like she was protected. And there was something about him from the very first time I met him. Something that my Doberman didn't like him. The hair on my arms stood up. You know, and they say dogs pick up on things. He could bring a big bone to the dog, and the dog's eyes would just kind of flame up, and he'd bare his teeth and wouldn't touch it. I mean, I thought that was really strange, but he'd take over. I'd never been around that type of personality. He'd walk in and he was going to play cards. He didn't know us. He'd shove everything off my coffee table and put out his cards. He'd climb on my kitchen counter, and Nikki would tell him, you know, Mom doesn't allow that. He'd stay there. And then I'd come around the corner after a while, and he'd still be there on the kitchen counter. I said, no, Mom doesn't allow that. And the look that he'd give me, it was just like, nobody's telling me anything. And it just built and built from there.
Now, I understand you're not saying to her, get rid of him, because you'd said, kind of implied, get rid of the other guy.
Well, I didn't really want her to get rid of the other guy. I just wanted her, thought I was doing what's best for her.
Then why did you not interfere in this relationship?
She was upset, said that I was not treating her as a grown-up, as an adult. She was 21 years old. Well, at the time she was 20. But because of her stature, I guess I smothered her. And she felt I wasn't letting her grow up to be the adult. So this time I decided to back off of all the dumb things to do. I backed off, and I thought, well, she'll see him for what he is. And Nikki started really changing. She started shaking. The fear was horrible. He would call continuously. She'd be out at night in the garage with her portable phone talking to him, and she broke it. She'd slam it down, whatever he was saying. She came in the house crying, and things that I found out after her death explained what was happening then, and it was just like he started taking over control.
How did you find out that she was murdered?
A fire chaplain came at 3:30 in the morning on the 29th. She was murdered on the 28th. And I was still up. I had moved into Nikki's room. I knew something was bad. I kept asking my husband to please call and talk to Nikki, because I felt he could get someplace that I couldn't, because she wanted to show Mom she can make it, you know, handle everything. And the chaplain came, and I got my husband up, and he went to the door, and he says, there's been a horrible...
I would think it would be like living a nightmare.
It is.
How did it all begin?
Well, you had mentioned also about the 5 years. It's 5 years ago tomorrow that I left this guy. So it's like an anniversary date for me. So this is a very emotional time. Back in 1986, I went to a Super Bowl party and met him. And he was a great guy. He swept me off my feet. I mean, just everything a woman would want. We started dating, and we became very serious very quickly. And we moved in together, and I was head over heels in love with him. And as our relationship progressed, I noticed small things with control, but I almost felt like it was because he loved me so much, little jealousy instances and stuff like that. I would get dressed for work, and he'd want me to change my clothes, or I'd go somewhere, and he'd say, you know, how do you know that person? And he'd be very insanely jealous. Well, it started with the emotional manipulation and control, and it began to escalate into, you know, physical abuse. And as the relationship progressed, I'd get strong and I'd leave, and then he'd say he'd changed, and I'd go back, and I left him on 3 separate occasions. The last time I left was November 8th of '91. I moved out of the house, and I think at that time when I moved out, he just assumed I'd go back like I did the other 3 times if he cried, and sent me flowers, and I was determined this time not to go back, and I had support from my family and friends, and I got my own apartment. He didn't start stalking me right away. He tried to woo me back. He sent me flowers all the time and cried, and just the typical honeymoon phase that a woman goes through when she's battered. When he saw he wasn't getting me back with that, he thought he'd take a different route. And one day I was driving up the highway, and I saw this great big billboard on the side of the highway saying, "Cindy, will you please marry me?" with his name on the bottom. I really don't want to mention his name. Which was unbelievable. And the next day I opened up the newspaper, and there were newspaper ads for me with marriage proposals again, and I still didn't go back. And at that same time, because this stuff was starting, I decided to take a job in a different state because I didn't want to run into him and see him. It was hard making the break and moving out emotionally in the first place, and I just didn't want to see him, and I had no idea it was going to escalate to this situation. Basically what happened is it started with phone calls. I get phone calls all the time, hundreds of calls a day. It started out with hang-ups, and then it progressed to threatening calls and then death threats. And I called the police, and they put a trap on my phone.
What did the police do for you?
Well, the police put a trap on my phone for me, and we were able to catch him calling from his home.
And then what did they do?
Well, it has an interesting twist with that. At the same time that he was doing this with me, he was dating another woman. And it turned out she was calling me too. Somehow, I don't know if it was a manipulation tactic or what kind of story he was telling her, but the calls were coming from his house and her work. So they both got arrested. They were charged with aggravated harassment.
How long? They were arrested. How long were they in jail?
They were arrested for aggravated harassment, and I went to court, and the charges were reduced to disorderly conduct, and they were let go that night.
Oh, so they didn't spend any time in jail?
The next day I got phone calls again.
On September 20th, 1993, their 15-year-old daughter, Jessica, went on a bike ride and never came home. 8 weeks after Jessica Roach disappeared, her naked body was found in a cornfield. She had been killed by a man who had a history of stalking young girls. Terry and Lauren, I know that this is the first time that you have gone on television to talk about your tragedy, and we want to thank you for being here. What happened on the day that Jessica disappeared?
Well, September 20th started just like any other Monday morning for us. The kids were getting ready for school. Jess was having a little trouble with her contacts. I helped her with it. I was getting ready to leave for work, which I had to drive about 150 miles away.
You live in a very rural area then.
Very rural, but I had just recently been transferred to another area, so I was getting ready to commute for the week. And I can remember helping her with her contact, and I remember thinking how pretty she was getting. So I went on to work, they went on to school. On about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, I got a phone call from my husband. he said, one of our daughters is missing. I didn't think a whole lot of it at the time. I said, which one? And he said, Jessy. And when he said Jessy, it just scared me to death because I knew something was wrong. He said that she had gone for a bike ride, that Mindy, my older daughter, had taken the car and gone to town, and she had passed her on our road, which was about a half a mile from home. They waved, Jess didn't want to go with her, and Mindy turned the corner and went on to the store in town. She came home about 20 minutes later and found Jessy's bike laying across our road. That seemed a little peculiar to her because, you know, it was a brand new bicycle, so she wouldn't have done that. She stopped the car because she had to move the bike in order to drive on home. There was a cornfield on one side and a bean field on the other side. They looked, yes, there was massive searches. We had, I don't know, I can't even tell you how many people. They were on horseback, we had helicopters, people on foot, in cars, they were combing the fields. They looked totally for 3 days trying to find her. Nothing came of it. We just waited. We waited by the phone. We had a lot of help from the authorities. They helped us out a lot.
You say they finally found her. Tell me how you heard about it.
We were in constant contact with the authorities all the time. We got a phone call. Actually, I got a phone call at work telling me that they had found a body in a cornfield about 10 miles from where we lived. They didn't know if it was Jessy or not, but they wanted us to know that they'd found someone. It took them a week to identify her because she had been there since September 20th. She apparently died just a few hours after he had taken her. So she'd been in that field for 7 to 8 weeks. She had no dental records. They couldn't tell just from looking at her who she was.
Trudy, you've been listening to our guest today. Is this fairly typical? Are these stalking stories fairly typical?
Yes, these stories are very typical of both of the kinds of stalkers, stranger stalkers and the simple obsessive stalker in which most domestic violence and jilted lovers, that category they fall into. You
have some very helpful ideas and ways that people can protect themselves if they're in a stalking situation. Would you describe these points, these things point by point? And by the way, if you are currently in this situation, you get out a pen and pad right now and take some notes, okay?
Some of the things that victims can do, especially if they are in a situation where they have begun to receive threats against their life, is to make sure that they have a safe place in their home. This means choosing one room and making sure that door to that room is a solid core wooden or metal door, not a hollow door. That there's a deadbolt lock on that door from the inside, and that you have a cellular phone that you can keep in that room. Take it with you in the car during the day, but keep it in that room so if the phone lines are cut, you can run to this safe place and call for help. Make sure if you're in a stalking situation that you document everything. Document phone calls, document the messages, document exactly what's said.
But I think Cindy didn't you document and nobody paid any attention to you?
Well, I tried to document everything I could. I kept a journal and I reported everything.
Exactly, and why that's important is because when it gets to the 8th and 9th time and the law enforcement is not listening to you or the court's not listening to you, they've not documented the case at the police department, you have something that can back up what you're saying to prove you're not crazy, because the automatic reaction
she's a crazy woman
of people is to say you're imagining this.
Okay.
So besides documenting, saving message tapes, just as Cindy did, that are left on the phone, making sure that when you begin to receive gifts, and as those gifts progressively become more threatening, progressing from flowers to candy to dead animals left on your doorstep, to make sure you document by photographs or actually keeping those things, making sure that you don't set up a pattern in your life, that you vary your routine.
We'll be right back.